You are not quiet because there is nothing happening. You are quiet because what is happening is too much to translate. There is a version of you that has been in the middle of a conversation your entire life, not with anyone in the room, but with everything at once. The weight of what was said and what wasn't, the thing beneath the thing, the feeling that arrived before you had words for it and stayed long after the moment that caused it had passed. The people around you see stillness. What they cannot see is the interior, running, always running, at a depth and a speed that has no equivalent in the visible world, and that you have learned over years to carry without showing, because the one time you tried to show it, the room didn't know what to do with what you brought into it. By the end of this video, through a 17th-century mathematician who sewed his most private discovery into the lining of his coat and wore it against his body until he died, through a clinical researcher who spent decades proving that the heaviness is not pathology but precision, and through a form of inquiry that does not ask you to silence the heavy mind, but to finally point it in the right direction, you will understand not just what you are carrying, but why. That understanding will not make it lighter, it will make it yours. In November 1654, a man named Blaise Pascal had an experience that lasted roughly 2 hours and that he spent the rest of his life trying to understand. Pascal was 31 years old and had already done more with a human mind than most people accomplish across several lifetimes. He had invented the mechanical calculator at 19. He had formulated the principles of fluid mechanics. He had produced foundational work in projective geometry, probability theory, and atmospheric pressure. He was, by any measure available to his century, a mind operating at the outer edge of what a human being could think. And he was, by every private account available to us, one of the most relentlessly restless, inwardly agitated, quietly suffering people of his age. The experience he had that November, he called it simply the Night of Fire, was not gradual. It arrived without warning, lasted from roughly 10:30 until midnight midnight, and left him so shaken and so certain that he wrote a record of it in his own hand on a piece of parchment and then sewed it into the lining of his coat. Not published, not shared, sewn into the fabric of the garment closest to his body, transferred from coat to coat every time he changed clothes, carried against his skin for the remaining 8 years of his life until it was found by a servant after his death, a private document worn like a wound or like an answer. He abandoned mathematics after that night, not because he lost his ability. He produced one of the most elegant proofs in the history of calculus in the months that followed, almost casually, as if to prove to himself that the capacity was still there. He abandoned it because he had concluded, after a lifetime of using the most precise instrument available to him, that the instrument could not reach the thing he most needed to understand. He turned for the rest of his life toward the one problem his intellect had circled since childhood and never solved, the problem he had described with surgical precision in a single sentence that has not aged in 400 years. All of humanity's problems, he wrote, stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. 3 questions. Hold them. Why did the most rigorous mind of the 17th century conclude that the restless mind was the root of all human suffering? What is actually happening in the interior of the person who cannot be still even when the room is quiet? And why is it always the quietest person in the room who is carrying the most?
In the 1980s, a clinical psychologist named Elaine Aron began noticing something in her practice that the diagnostic manuals of her field had no adequate category for. She was seeing patients who were not disordered, who showed no signs of anxiety disorder, depression, or any of the conditions her training had prepared her to identify, but who were, without exception, exhausted in a specific and particular way. Not the exhaustion of illness, not the exhaustion of overwork, the exhaustion of someone who has been processing everything at a depth that the world around them was not designed to accommodate for as long as they could remember, with no framework for understanding why the experience of being alive felt so much heavier for them than it appeared to for everyone else. What Aram discovered and spent the following decades documenting in clinical research, neuroimaging studies, and longitudinal surveys across cultures is that approximately 15 to 20% of the human population is born with a nervous system that processes sensory and emotional information more deeply than the other 80%. She called it sensory processing sensitivity. And what she found is that it is not a disorder, it is not a deficit, it is not shyness or introversion or neuroticism or any of the other categories that have been used with varying degrees of precision to describe people who seem to feel things more intensely and think things more thoroughly than the people around them. It is a different architecture of processing, one that notices more, connects more simultaneously, reflects more before acting, and registers the emotional texture of experience at a resolution that most people simply do not have access to. The neuroscience clarifies what this means at the level of the brain itself. Functional MRI studies of highly sensitive individuals show significantly greater activation in the insula, the region associated with bodily awareness, empathy, and the integration of emotional information, as well as in the areas responsible for processing complex perceptual data and making nuanced distinctions between stimuli that other nervous systems filter out before they reach conscious awareness. The highly sensitive brain is not overreacting, it is accurately reporting a more complete picture. The problem is that the world was not built for that level of reporting, and no one handed you a manual for what to do with the surplus. Think about what this means for the experience you have been having your entire life, the conversation that ended hours ago but is still running in you, not because you are anxious, but because you noticed something in it that the other person did not notice and that you have not finished processing. The room you walked into that was ostensibly empty of event and that registered in your nervous system as a field of information, tension in the air, something unresolved in the posture of the people in it, a quality of silence that told you more than the words that followed. The piece of music, or the sentence in a book, or the particular quality of light at a specific hour of the day that landed in you with a weight entirely disproportionate to what anyone watching you would have been able to see. These are not sensitivities to be managed. They are the receipts of a nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do, processing deeply, connecting precisely, registering the full texture of a world that most people experience at a fraction of the resolution. But here is the weight that comes with the depth. A nervous system that processes everything more thoroughly also processes everything more thoroughly. The grief that should have passed in a week sits in you for a month because you have not finished understanding it. The criticism that should have glanced off lodges because your mind found something true in it and cannot release the thing until the examination is complete. The future that other people approach with a rough and serviceable optimism arrives in you already populated with every implication you have traced, every outcome you have modeled, every cost you have already paid in imagination before the event has occurred. You are not catastrophizing, you are completing the calculation that your nervous system began the moment the data arrived, and the calculation takes longer, goes deeper, and costs more than anyone watching you would ever be able to see from the outside. Pascal knew this cost, not in the clinical vocabulary Aron would develop 3 centuries later, but in the precise and exhausted language of a man who had been running the same interior calculation his entire life, and had finally, in a November night in 1654, found the one thing his relentless processing could not account for. What he did not have, what would not be articulated for another 3 centuries, was the name for what the heavy mind is actually searching for.
Ramana Maharshi, whose encounter with the question of the self you have already met, taught one practice above all others. He called it vichara, self-inquiry, And the description he gave of it is the most precise response to Elaine Aron's clinical finding that exists in the contemplative literature, even though he offered it 300 years before her research, and from a tradition that had no knowledge of neuroimaging or sensory processing sensitivity. Vichara does not ask you to stop thinking. It does not ask you to quiet the mind through effort or technique or the disciplined suppression of the interior. What it observes is something more specific, that the deeply thinking, deeply feeling mind is already oriented toward inquiry, already moving in the direction of the real, already equipped with precisely the instrument that genuine self-knowledge requires. The problem is not the capacity, the problem is the direction. The heavy mind has been pointing outward, at the world, at other people, at the implications of events, at the unresolved texture of experience, with the full force of its processing depth. Vichara asks a single question in the direction the mind has not yet looked. Who is the one doing all this processing? Not what are you thinking, not what are you feeling. Who is the awareness in which the thinking and the feeling are arising? This is not a spiritual bypass. This is not the suggestion that the deeply sensitive person should retreat from the world they feel so completely. What Ramana was pointing toward, and what the entire Advaita Vedanta tradition had been building the vocabulary for across centuries of contemplative investigation, is the recognition that the very depth of processing that makes the quiet person's interior so relentlessly active is also the depth that, correctly directed, can find its own source. The instrument is not the problem. The instrument has simply been aimed in every direction except the one that would answer the question the heaviness has been asking all along. Consider what the heavy mind is actually doing when it processes so deeply. It is not malfunctioning, it is searching. Every loop of thought that does not resolve, every feeling that will not be discharged, every question that gets traced to its origin only to generate 3 more questions, these are not symptoms of a restless disorder. They are the behavior of a mind that has not yet found the level at which its questions can be answered. The highly sensitive person is closer to genuine self-knowledge than almost anyone around them, not despite the heaviness, but because of it. Because the same depth of processing that makes ordinary experience so costly is the capacity that, turned inward, can see through the surface of the mind to what is carrying it. Pascal arrived at this not through teaching, but through experience. The night of fire was not a mystical event that interrupted his thinking. It was the moment his outward-pointing mind, the mind that had calculated the pressure of the atmosphere and proved the theorems of projective geometry and built a machine to perform arithmetic, finally turned in the only direction it had not yet looked and found something it could not calculate, could not systematize, could not reduce to a proof, something that simply was. And that was enough. Return to Pascal. Return to the coat. Return to a man who had spent his life being the person in the room who noticed everything, processed everything, carried everything, who had, in Aron's language, a nervous system operating at full capacity in a world that had no vocabulary for what that cost, sewing a private record of a 2-hour experience into the lining of the garment closest to his body, because he had no other way to carry it. Not published, not explained, worn. The night of fire was not the resolution of Pascal's restlessness. He remained, by all accounts, a difficult and driven and inwardly agitated man until his death at 39. But something changed in the direction of his attention after that night. He stopped trying to solve the problem of the restless mind by producing more output from it. He started asking what the mind was restless toward. Not what it was producing, but what it was reaching for. Not the content of the interior world, but the awareness that was registering it. This is the reframe that the quiet person carrying the heavy mind has been waiting for. Not the one that promises relief, not the one that tells you the sensitivity is a gift and that one day you will be grateful for it,
not the consolation that the depth that costs you so much is secretly an advantage. The reframe is structural. The heaviness is not something happening to you, it is something you are doing. Specifically, the action of a mind with extraordinary depth of processing, pointing that depth at a world that cannot absorb it, running the calculation to its conclusion, finding that the conclusion generates a new question, and repeating. The heaviness is the surplus of a capacity that has not yet been given its correct object. You are not carrying too much. You are carrying everything in the wrong direction. The quiet on the outside is real. The weight on the inside is real. What has not yet been named for most of the quiet people carrying heavy minds is that the weight is not a symptom of something wrong with the instrument. It is the instrument, precise, deep, relentless, waiting to be pointed somewhere that can finally hold the full force of what it is capable of producing. You were not built to be lighter. You were built to go deeper. The question is not how to carry less. The question is what you are carrying it toward. You are not too much. You have simply been too much for the wrong containers. If this named something you have been carrying without knowing it had a name, share it with one quiet person who needs to hear it, not for the channel, for them.